Hi, everyone. Welcome to the content talk about the theories of language development. This is going to be a very brief overview of those three major theoretical contributions, who contributed to those, and really the essence of how that theory has been applied in thinking about language acquisition. So I am just going to share my desktop with you and then be able to scroll through the associated slides that are just going to help visually organize this information. All right, so this course, this content talk directly connects to the course outcome where you're applying theories of language acquisition and empirical research. So part of the research component will be shared throughout all of the presentations that you will see from some of our national experts on language acquisition. And then these are the theories that are the central contributions to not only how child development knowledge was developed over time in terms of milestones, or if we think about stages of language acquisition, but then also the approach to teaching children to learn language and acquire some of those incremental skills. Throughout this whole semester, you're going to be thinking about each aspect of language and literacy development as a domain. So this holistic view of, what's happening for oral language development, what's happening as you're moving from oral language development to more of literacy development, and then all of those things combined move to reading. Skills as a domain. Sorry, I said skills just there. I meant to say just all of the skills that combine that domain. And then there's individual skills that build over time. And that's where our milestones come into play. So in this content talk, really you're going to be able to identify and explain the major theorists and their theories of language development. So there's an overview. We have the three major perspectives, which are going to be very familiar to you from thinking about child psychology, child development, educational psychology courses. That's behaviorism, nativism, and social constructivism. Now, those three theories are also theories for cognitive development, theories for learning in general, but then these specific theories also address how is language, how do children acquire language? I mean, if you think about language development, it is an amazing feat that what happens from 0 to 6 months, and then from 6 months to 2 years, and then again from 2 years old to 5 years old, a very young child learns and understands and constructs this knowledge of an oral language subsystem that leads to the interconnectedness of these subsystems that then leads to future reading capabilities. So this is an amazing feat. But these are the three major perspectives. Each of these perspectives had influencers who really helped craft, and I just picked some of the most notable ones specifically for language development. So Pavlov, if you remember from early psychology stages, thinking about Pavlov's dog and all of that reinforcement training, Watson, and then B.F. Skinner, those individuals really helped contribute to what we know as the behaviorism. That has actually influenced a lot of teaching, and I'm not going to necessarily say that it's all bad, but it certainly has led to a lot of direct instruction in grades that I wish we weren't doing so much direct instruction in. So that behavior transmission model where the teacher has the example, the teacher models it, the teacher tells how it should be done, and then children imitate, and then they get a positive reinforcement if they've imitated correctly. Then we have nativism. Nativism was really helped, Noam Chomsky really helped develop this idea of how language development is this innate process. So innate means it's heavily relying on what you're given naturally or by nature. And so one thing that's really has been important that's come out of this is the idea of critical periods. So if you think about what you know about brain research, we understand that there's certain critical periods when the brain is more open to this development. Although what we know now about the brain is still a little bit different than what Noam Chomsky had first conceived. Then we have social constructivism or social constructivist approach. Piaget, Lev Vygotsky, Jerome Bruner are just a few of the constructivist theorists, but these three in particular addressed language in their theory. And of course, they help to influence a social constructivist model of teaching. So let's first look at a behaviorist view of language development. The behaviorist position relies heavily on Watson's notion that the individual is shaped or reinforced positively or negatively through patterns of a stimulus and response. So usually that comes from some force in the environment. A classical explanation for this theory is as follows. By giving positive reinforcement, such as praising, smiling, some sort of positive interaction, when a desired behavior occurs, and then administering some sort of negative reinforcement, such as scolding or correcting, when an undesired behavior occurs, then one presumably strengthens the desired behavior, making it more likely to occur, and then limits the unwanted behavior, making it less likely to occur. This theory that suggests that nurture, so I'm going to be talking about the lifelong tug of war between nature and nurture ideas. Nature meaning very innate, what you were born with. Some could say God-given, others could say genetic code of, you know, what was my brain like, what were my genes like, what's my IQ, versus nurture in terms of the environment. So behaviorism relies heavily on nurture, that the child is molded in the way that they are taught by parents, by other adults within a given environment. This theory is grounded in classical basic processes, which is classical and operant conditioning. And really based on Pavlov's work, John Watson extended those ideas and really became the pioneer of behaviorism. And then B.F. Skinner, who was a student of Watson's, then further developed that. So just understanding that the classical conditioning is learning a behavior through the process of association and involves conditioning of that response to new stimuli. And so the stimulus is a feature of the environment, and then the response is the elicited behavior. So an example that's in the handout refers to when a baby is babbling, right? When a baby is babbling, you have to go back and look at the milestones and what is it that young children are going to be babbling first. Well, first it's vowels, and then there's things called variegated vowels and all these other types of sounds that are very, very vowel sounding like. And then and of course before that is cooing, some other incidental sounds, and then there becomes a little more intentional babbling, and then we will see babies start to involve consonants in their babbling. So when that babble turns into maybe an initial sound with ma, 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 you know, and the mother is smiling, the mother is saying mama, and that is going back and forth in this exchange. And then the sound is reinforced. You know, the child is still trying to associate this mama with mama. And then once that is reinforced, it's considered learned. Noam Chomsky is the major contributor to the nativist. Sometimes it's referred to as the innativist. So innate, that helps us understand this is heavily reliant on what is given in nature. So how a human being is formed and developed based on that genetic code. The Nativism Theory believes that there are innate features of a human being that attribute to language acquisition. And Noam Chomsky actually developed this idea that there was a universal capacity of linguistic structures for young children. Now, to some degree, he was correct. There's a really brilliant scientist who's been studying and actually been able to look in young children's brains with advanced brain scanning imaging technology. This is Dr. Patricia Kuhl's work. And what she really has discovered is that the young infant is like a citizen of the world. She coined that phrase because from 0 to 6 months, young children, they're tuning in to the sounds of their home language and the sounds around them. And that is actually forming and pruning and shaping the speech sounds and the language that they'll be speaking in. And so to some degree, it's interesting, Noam Chomsky was onto something. He often associated this term or this idea of his, this framework of linguistics, as a language acquisition device, an LAD. It was conceptually an idea that this notion of universal features of language were interwoven with neurological, so we're thinking about brain development capacities, and that it was basically triggered with exposure to language on a predetermined course. Because the language acquisition device viewpoint, nativists believe that children develop language in spite of interactions. So it's really, for a little bit, you think, well, maybe it's relying on some of the environment. Most of the time, it's purely that there is this predetermined course. And one of the examples is that, you know, there are predictable errors that young children will make. Specifically, we can think of ones that we experience in preschool when children are misusing past tense. And so, you know, those predictable errors occur, and, you know, such as when young children first are beginning to use those past tense, they might say drinked, you know, I drinked that already, instead of I drank that already. And that's because, you know, past tense is ed, but these are these irregular verbs that we know conjugate differently, and they actually change word form. Well, that would be something that you have to learn from someone else, not that it's not the innate pattern that his theory is setting out. So that's just a little interesting things about that. How might a nativism be applied in the classroom setting? Well, one thing that he certainly was onto is that there has to be typical patterns of development, and that there are structures in the brain that are related, and features that are related to language acquisition. So if we know those, then as teachers, we can predict what we can expect at certain ages for children to be able to know and do. And then that helps us keep developmentally appropriate practice in check. For example, I see a lot of teachers bringing alphabet principle into toddler classrooms. Direct instruction of the alphabet isn't really developmentally appropriate at all for children who are not at that stage of development. Doesn't mean that if we have children who just happen to be a 2-year-old that's already identifying stuff, probably because of very, 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 very early experiences, doesn't mean we're not going to interact with books and do a lot of meaningful things. It just means we're not bringing in flashcards and other types of behavioristic things for the very, very young child. That's just one example. I could go on, but I'm trying to keep our content talk here to the time frame that I wanted it to be for you. All right, so social constructivist theory. So Piaget, he was really, he talked a little bit about the socialization. Lev Vygotsky talked about it even more. And then Jerome Bruner is someone who you may not have read as much about. Even though Vygotsky gets a lot of credit for scaffolding, Jerome Bruner actually helped to help us understand like a spiraling curriculum, and how we introduce topics and how we come back to topics and how we go into topics deeper. And we do that throughout different ages in order to have that depth of knowledge. entry-level knowledge, and then scaffold that knowledge. So these three have contributed to understanding the influence of social interactions and cultural context in children's learning of language. The social interactions theory is a blend. So where we had nurture as the behavioristic approach, then we had nature as the nativism approach. We've got nature and nurture working together instead of it being nature versus nurture. So it's a blend. Social interactionists rely on human development and learning that occurs within an environmental context, particularly a social, cultural context. And really, Vygotsky would even add historical. So we can think about Bronfenbrenner, who I haven't listed on here, who is a social constructivist. Bronfenbrenner, his ecological systems model is very similar to how Vygotsky views the child in their home context with parents as first teachers, and then in their school context, and how those two systems are interacting, working together. Then when we go out the farthest point of Bronfenbrenner's systems model, we will see the chronosystem, which means the historical parts of time. So I think about the fact that COVID-19 will be a historical event that definitely impacts the social cultural context of the child's learning. You know, in the past, I had to use examples like World War II and other types of world catastrophes. And so here we are with COVID. You know, we know our young children are going to be very affected by this, even if it's not in something overtly that we can see. So that's just an example of what it means to have a chronosystem, this outward-most historical part of time. That represents time. All right, so back on track here. Vygotsky asserted that language is a mental tool for thinking. And so he really contributed to help understand that cognitive development and language development were very much being laid on this foundation, and that it was the language development that was allowing us to understand the cognitive capabilities of children. You know, before children, when children are pre-verbal, we're not sure what they're thinking. We're only able to intently observe infants and toddlers' actions, their movements, maybe their gaze, their stare, their interactions. We have to be intently watching. But then Vygotsky really studied language and understood that as a mental tool. So a tool that not only is building its own development of language, but that it is also building the development of cognitive thinking. And so language helps to build these cognitive processes through the children's involvement in shared activities and shared situations. So shared activity is a coined phrase for Vygotsky. And I think a lot about that with what you've learned about the class model. And just in class, I mean the classroom assessment scoring system, and how vital we have learned that interactions are. In fact, the quality of the preschool teaching comes down to the quality of the interactions between the adults and the children. So if you're really pushing children to think, that means you're really helping them use language in more sophisticated ways, or maybe you're helping them discover, what is the language that I'm hearing being spoken at school? How does it connect to what I'm speaking at home? You know, that's another way to see this. And then, how am I using language to learn? You know, how is the teacher helping the child develop thinking skills with language? So shared activity is when adults are a part of it. You can't send children off to center time and think that they're going to learn on their own. Now, sometimes, for some children, they will, in spite of us, they will. They just come. They come ready to go. And that's a phenomenon in itself. But for most children, in order for us to optimize their learning, and especially for children who are considered diverse learners, you know, maybe they come from a home whose family has low income. Maybe they come from a home whose family has been historically marginalized in education and their experiences are different. We know there's enough statistics that tell us those children need to have high quality interactions. So the shared activity of a teacher being present, and whether that means supporting play, encouraging play, dialoguing, prompting thoughts, prompting thought processes, prompting thinking. Bruner helped to make something really clear, and that's something called child-directed speech. Child-directed speech aims to attract the baby's attention. So we really can see the youngest infant tuning in to the sound of the voices of the people in their immediate world, and they're starting to pick up on the sounds even in your utero. So prior to being born, children are developing language acquisition. With child-directed speech, that's when the adult is breaking down adult language into understandable chunks so that the child can really hone in on the message. So instead of saying a 10 or 12 word sentence, it would be these shorter chunks. And it helps to make the conversation predictable for the child. Interestingly enough, this often includes, child-directed speech often includes a higher pitch, repeated sentence frames, and the repetition of adults' words, and often includes the use of the child's name rather than pronouns, which is interesting because pronouns actually comes a little bit later. Well, doesn't come in the first year of life is what I'm getting at. And so this child-directed speech is much like motherese. You may have heard of motherese, where when we see that little baby, I have this little voice already. And when I am with young children, especially those littlest infants, I immediately go into motherese. And that's that high-pitched voice. Now, interestingly, this is universal. So, I could show you a video of Dr. Patricia Kuhl's work, and, even a Taiwanese mother, a mother who speaks Mandarin, a mother who speaks English. At some point, they all were using this child-directed speech or motherese. The difference is the pitch is different via each different language. So the pitch and where we emphasize things. Now, and that's a side note. But an interesting one. So language is a cultural and mental tool. That's all Vygotsky. And something that these theorists have really contributed is, again, the understanding that there are well-defined periods or developmental stages related to language acquisition. All right. I would just suggest reviewing a little bit of the information on the handout and reviewing this information, and I'm pretty sure you'll be just fine with your language acquisition, language acquisition theory quiz.